Let's end February with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Part 1. Where are we? On August 6, 1965, the president's room could scarcely hold a multitude of white and Negro leaders crowding it. President Lyndon Johnson's high spirits were marked as he circulated among the many guests whom he had invited to witness an event he confidently felt to be historic, the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The legislation was designed to put the ballot effectively into the hands of the South, into the Negro hands in the South after a century of denial by terror and evasion. The bill laid on the polished mahogany desk was born in violence in Selma, Alabama, where a stubborn sheriff handling Negroes in the Southern tradition had stumbled against the future. During a nonviolent demonstration for voting rights, the sheriff had directed his men in tear gassing and beating the marchers to the ground. The nation had seen and heard and exploded in indignation and protest. Negroes and whites marched 50 miles through Alabama and arrived at the state capital of Montgomery in a demonstration 50,000 strong. President Johnson, describing Selma as a modern Concord, addressed the joint session of Congress before a televised audience of millions. He pledged that we shall overcome and declared that the national government must, by law, ensure to every Negro his full rights as a citizen. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the result. In signing the measure, the president announced that today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that has ever been won on any battlefield. Today we strike away the last shackle of fierce and anxious bonds. 1 year later, some of the people who had been brutalized in Selma and who were present at the Capitol ceremonies were leading marches in the suburbs of Chicago amid a rain of rocks and bottles, among burning automobiles, to the thunder of jeering thousands, many of them waving Nazi flags. A year later, some of the Negro leaders who had been present in Selma and at the Capitol ceremonies no longer held office in their organizations. They had been discarded to symbolize a radical change of tactics. A year later, the white backlash had become so emotional and it's so emotional an electoral issue in the state of California, Maryland, and elsewhere. In several southern states, men long regarded as political clowns had become governors or only narrowly missed election, their magic achieved, which a witch's brew of bigotry, prejudice, half-truths, and whole lies. During that year, white and Negro civil rights workers had been murdered in several Southern communities. The swift and easy acquittal that followed for the accused had shocked much of the nation, but sent a wave of unabashed triumph through the Southern segregationist circles. Many of us wept at the funeral services for the dead and for the American democracy. During that year, in several northern and western cities, most tragically in Watts, young Negroes had exploded in violence. In an irrational burst of rage, they had sought to say something, but the flames had blackened both themselves and their oppressors. A year later, Ramparts magazine was asserting, after more than a decade of the civil rights movement, the black American in Harlem, Haynesville, Baltimore, and Bogalusa is worse off today than he was 10 years ago. The movement's leaders know it, and it is the source of their despair. The movement is in despair because it has been forced to recognize the Negro Revolution as a myth. Had Negroes fumbled the opportunity described by the president? Was the movement in despair? Why was the widespread sympathy with Negro Revolution abruptly submerged in indifference in some quarters or banished by outright hostility in others? Why was there ideological disarray? A simple explanation holds that Negroes wider than Watts. The voice of black power was heard through the land, and the white backlash was born. The public became infuriated and sympathy evaporated. The pat explanation found us, however, on the hard fact that the change in mood had preceded Watts and the Black Power slogan. Moreover, the white backlash had always existed underneath and sometimes on the surface of American life. No, the answers are both more complex and, for the long run, less pessimistic. With Selma and the Voting Rights Act, one phase of the development in the Civil Rights Revolution came to an end. A new phase opened, but few observers realized it or were prepared for its implications. For the vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase had been a struggle to treat Negroes with a degree of decency, not of equality. White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, and all forms of discrimination. The outraged white citizen has been sincere when he snatched the whips from the southern sheriffs and forbid them more cruelty. But when this was to the degree accomplished, the emotion that had momentarily inflamed him melted away. White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationists and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. When Negroes looked for the second phase of realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared. The Negroes of America had taken the president, the press, and the pulpit at their word when they spoke in broad terms of freedom and justice. But the absence of brutality and unregenerated evil is not the presence of justice. To stay murder is not the same thing as to ordain brotherhood. The word was broken and the free-running expectations of the Negro crashed into the stone walls of white resistance. The result was havoc. Negroes felt cheated, especially in the North, while many whites felt that the Negroes had gained so much it was virtually imprudent and greedy to ask for more so soon. The path of the Negro-white unity had been converging, crossed at Selma, and like a giant X began to diverge. Up to Selma, there had been unity to eliminate barbaric conduct, yet it was the unity that had to be based on a fulfillment of equity, and in the absence of agreement, the paths began inexorably to move apart. Why is equality so acidly avoided? Why does white America delude itself, and how does it rationalize the evil it retains? The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth towards a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. Overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradictions. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming such changes, but too quickly apathy and disinterest rise to the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken. Laws are passed in a crisis mood after a Birmingham or a Selma, but no substantive fervor survives the formal signing of legislation. The recording of the law in itself is treated as the reality of the reform. This limited degree of concern is a reflection of inner conflict which measures cautiously the impact of any change on the status quo. As the nation passes from opposing extremist behavior to the deeper and more pervasive elements of equality, white America reaffirms its bonds to the status quo. It is now contemplated comfortably hugging the shoreline, but now fears that the winds of change are blowing it out to sea. The practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the psychological adjustment is far more than formidable. Having exaggerated the emotional difficulties for decades when demand for new conduct became inescapable, white Southerners may have trembled under the strain, but they did not collapse. Even the more significant changes involved in voter registration required neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice. Spectacular and turbulent events that dramatized the demand created an erroneous impression that a heavy burden was involved. The real cost lays ahead. The stiffening of white resistance is a recognition of that fact. The discount education given Negroes will in the future have to be purchased at full price if quality education is to be realized. Jobs are harder and costlier to create than voting rolls. The eradication of slum housing millions is complex far beyond integrating buses and lunch counters. The assistant director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, Hyman Bookbinder, in a frank statement on December 29, 1966, declared that the long-range cost of adequately implementing programs to fight poverty, ignorance, and slums will reach $1 trillion. He was not awed or dismayed by this progress, but instead pointed out that the growth of the gross national product during the same period makes this expenditure comfortably possible. It is, he said, as simple as this. The poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate. Furthermore, he predicted that unless a substantial sacrifice is made by the American people, the nation can expect further deterioration of the city's increased antagonisms between the races and continued disorders in the street. He asserted that people are not informed enough to give adequate support to anti-poverty programs, and he leveled a share of the blame at the government because it must do more to get people to understand the size of the problem. Let us take a look at the size of the problem through the lens of the Negro status in 1967. When the Constitution was written, a strange formula to determine taxes and representation declared that the Negro was 60% a person. Today, another curious formula seems to declare he is 50% of a person. Of all the good things in life, he has approximately one half those of whites. Of all the bad things, he has twice those of whites. Thus, half of all Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half the income of whites. When we turn to negative experiences of life, the Negro has a double share. There are twice as many unemployed. The rate of infant mortality, widely accepted as an accurate index of general health among Negroes, is double that of whites. The equation pursues Negroes even in the war. There are twice as many Negroes as whites in combat in Vietnam at the beginning of 1967, and twice as many Negro soldiers died in action, 20.6% in proportion to their numbers in the population. In the other spheres, the figures are equally alarming. In elementary schools, Negroes lag 1 to 3 years behind whites, and their segregated schools receive substantially less money per student than do the white schools. 1/20 as many Negroes as whites attend college, and half of these are in ill-equipped Southern institutions. Of employed Negroes, 75% hold menial jobs. Depressed living standards for Negroes are not simply the consequence of neglect, nor can they be explained by the myth of the Negro's innate incapacities, or by more sophisticated rationalization of his acquired infirmities, family disorganization, poor education. They are a structural part of the economic system in the United States. Certain industries and enterprises are based upon a supply of low-paid, underskilled, and immobile non-white labor. Hand assembly factories, hospital service industries, housework, agricultural operations using itinerant labor would suffer economic trauma, if not disaster, with a rise in wage scales. Economic discrimination is especially deep-rooted in the South, and industry after industry. There is a significant differential in wage scales between the North and the South. The lower scales in the South is directly a consequence of cheap Negro labor, which ironically not only deprives the Negro, but its presence drives down the wages of the white worker. The New South, while undergoing certain marked changes as a result of industrialization, is adapting to forms of discrimination that keeps the Negro in a subordinate role and holds his wage scales close to the bottom. The personal torment of discrimination cannot be measured on a numerical scale, but the grim evidence of its hold on white Americans is revealed in polls that indicate 88% of them would object if their teenage child dated a Negro. Almost 80% would mind it if a close friend or relative married a Negro, and 50% would not want a Negro as a neighbor. These brief facts disclose the magnitude of the gap between existing realities and the goals of equality, yet they would be less disturbing if it were not for a greater difficulty that there is not even a common language when the term equality is used. Negro and white have a fundamentally different definition. Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talked of it as an objective. But most whites in America in 1967, including persons of goodwill, proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects to retain it. Most of the abrasions between the Negroes and the white liberals arise from this fact. White America is uneasy with injustice, and for 10 years it believed it was righting wrongs. The struggle was often bravely fought by fine people. The conscience of man flamed high in hours of peril. The days can never be forgotten when the brutalities of Selma caused thousands all over the land to rush to our side, heedless of danger and of differences in race, class, and religion. After the march to Montgomery, there was a delay at the airport, and several thousand demonstrators waited more than 5 hours, crowding together on the seats, the floors, and the stairways of the terminal building. As I stood with them and saw white and Negro, nuns and priests, ministers and rabbis, labor organizers, lawyers, doctors, housemaids, shop workers, brimming with vitality and enjoying a rare comradeship, I knew I was seeing a microcosm of the mankind of the future in this moment of a luminous and genuine brotherhood. But these were the best of America, not all of America. Elsewhere, the commitment was shallower. Conscience burned only dimly, and when atrocious behavior was curbed, the spirit settled easily into well-padded pockets of complacency. Justice at the deepest level had few sturdy champions. A good many observers have remarked that if equality could come at once, the Negro would not be ready for it. I submit that the white American is even more unprepared. The Negro on a mass scale is working vigorously to overcome his deficiency and his maladjustments. Whenever there are job training programs, Negroes are crowding them. Those who are employed are revealing an eagerness for advancement never before so widespread and persistent. In the average Negro home, a new appreciation of culture is manifest. The circulation of periodicals and books written for Negroes is now in the multi-millions, while a decade ago it was scarcely past 100,000. In the schools, more Negro students are demanding courses that lead to college and beyond, refusing to settle for the crude vocational training that was limited to so many in the past. Whites, it must be frankly said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. The reality of substantive investment to assist Negroes into the 20th century adjusting to Negro neighbors and genuine school integration is still a nightmare for all too many white Americans. White Americans would like you to believe that in the past 10 years, a mechanism that somehow been created that needed only orderly and smooth tending for the painless accomplishment of change. Yet this is precisely what has not been achieved. Every civil rights law is still substantially more dishonored then all this school desegregation is still 90% unimplemented across the land. The free exercise of the franchise is the exception rather than the rule in the South. Open occupancy laws theoretically apply to population centers embracing tens of millions, but grim ghettos contradict the fine language of the legislation. Despite the mandates of the law, equal employment still remains a distant dream. The legal structures have in practice proved to be neither structures nor law. The sparse and inefficient collection of statutes is not a statute, it is barely a naked framework. Legislation that is evaded, substantially nullified, and enforced is a mockery of law. Significant progress has effectively been barred by the cunning obstruction of segregationists. It has been barred by the evocations and retreats of government, the same government that was exalted when it sought political credit for enacting the measures. In this light, we are now able to see why the Supreme Court decisions on school desegregation, which we described at the time as historic, have not made any history. After 12 years, barely 12% school integration existed in the whole South, and in the Deep South, the figure hardly reached 2%, and even these few schools were in many cases integrated only with a handful of Negroes. The decisions indeed mandated a profound degree of genuine equality, and for that very reason they failed of implementation. They were, in a sense, historical errors from the point of view of white America. Even the Supreme Court, despite its original courage and integrity, curbed itself only a little over a year after the 1954 landmark cases, when it handed down its pupil placement decision, in effect returning to the states the power to determine the tempo of change. This subsequent decision became the keystone in the structure that slowed school desegregation down to a crawl. Thus, America, with segregationist obstruction and majority indifference, silently nibbled away at a promise of true equality that had come before its time. These are the deepest causes for contemporary abrasions between the races. Loose and easy language about equality, resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear, but not for the Negro. There is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough. Each step forward accents an ever-present tendency to backlash. This characterization is necessarily general. It would be grossly unfair to admit recognition of a minority of whites who generally want authentic equality. Their commitment is real, sincere, and is expressed in 1,000 deeds, but they are balanced at the other end of the pole by the unregenerate segregationists who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. The segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms with the reestablishment of naked opposition and, if need be, a native form of fascism. America has a master race in the antebellum South. Reestablishing it with a resurgent Klan and a totally disenfranchised lower class would realize the dream of too many extremists on the right. The great majority of Americans are suspended between these opposing attitudes. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it. The persistence of racism and death and the dawning awareness that the Negro demands will necessitate structural changes in society has generated a new phase of white resistance in both the North and South. Based on the cruel judgment that Negroes have come far enough, there is a strong mood to bring the civil rights movement to a halt or to reduce it to a crawl. Negro demands that yesterday evoked admiration and support, today too many have become tiresome, unwarranted, and a disturbance to the enjoyment of life. Cries of black power and rise are not the causes of white resistance, they are the consequences of it. Meanwhile, frustration and a loss of confidence in white power has endangered among many Negroes a response that is essentially a loss of confidence in themselves. They are failing to appreciate two important facts. First, the line of progress is never straight. For a period of For a period, a movement may follow a straight line and then it encounters obstacles and the path bends. It is like curving around a mountain when you are approaching a city. Often it feels as though you are moving backwards and you lose sight of your goal, but in fact you are moving ahead and soon you will see the city again closer by. We are encountering that just as in experience today, the inevitable counter-revolution that succeeds every period of progress is taking place. Failing to understand this as a normal process of development, some Negroes are falling into unjustified pessimism and despair. Focusing on the ultimate goal and discovering it is still distant, they declare no progress at all has been made. This mood illustrates another fact that has been misinterpreted. A final victory is the accumulation of many short-term encounters. To lightly dismiss a success because it does not usher in a complete order of justice is to fail to comprehend the process of achieving full victory. It underestimates the value of confrontation and dissolves the confidence born of a partial victory by which new efforts are powered. The argument that the Negro has made progress in a decade of turbulent effort rests on a demonstrable fact that paints an ugly picture of stagnation in many areas, including some income levels, housings, and schools. But from a deeper perspective, a different conclusion emerges. The increases in segregated schools and the expanded slums are developments confined largely to the North. Substantial progress has been achieved in the South. The struggle of the past decade were not national in scope, they were Southern. They were specifically designed to change life in the South, and the principal role of the North was supportive. It would be a serious error to misconstrue the movement's strategy by measuring Northern accomplishments when virtually all programs were applied in the South and sought remedies applicable solely to it. The historical achievement is found in the fact that the movement in the South has profoundly shaken the entire edifice of segregation. There is an accomplishment whose consequences are deeply felt by every Southern Negro in his daily life. It is no longer possible to count the number of public establishments that are open to Negroes. The persistence of segregation is not the salient fact of the Southern experience. The proliferating areas in which the Negro moves freely is a new advancing truth. The South was the stronghold of racism. In the white migration through history from the South to the North and West, racism was carried to poison the rest of the nation. Prejudice, discrimination, and bigotry have been intrinsically embedded in all institutions of Southern life, political, social, and economic. There could be no possibility of transforming change anywhere so long as the vast and solid influence of Southern segregation remained unchallenged and unhurt. The 10-year assault at the roots was fundamental to undermining the system. What distinguished this period from all preceding decades was it constituted the first frontal attack on racism at its heart. Since before the Civil War, the alliance of the Southern racism and Northern reaction have been the major roadblock of all social advancement. The cohesive political structure of the South working through this alliance enabled a minority of the population to imprint its ideology on the nation's laws. This explains why the United States is still behind European nations in all forms of social legislation. England, France, Germany, Sweden, all distinctively less wealthy than us, provide more security relative for their people. Hence, in attacking Southern racism, the Negro has already benefited not only himself, but the nation as a whole. Until the disproportionate political power of the reactionary South in Congress is ended, progress in the United States will always be fitful and uncertain. Since the beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution, Negro registration in almost every southern state has increased by at least 100%, in Virginia and Alabama by 300 and 600% respectively. There are no illusions among Southern segregationists that gains are unimportant. The old order has already lost ground. Its retreats are symbolized by the departure from public life of Sheriff Clark and Bull Connor. Far more important, the races have restructured old parties to cope with the emerging challenge. In some states, such as Georgia and Alabama, white supremacy temporarily holds the state house, but it would be short-sighted politician who felt secure with this victory. In both of these states, the most serious contender in recent elections was a white former governor who publicly welcomed the Negro vote, shaped his policies to it, and worked with the Negro political organizations in the campaign. This change in itself is a revolutionary event. This amazing transformation took place in 1 decade of struggle after 10 decades of virtually total disenfranchisement. The future shape of Southern politics will never again operate without a strong Negro electorate as a significant force. Even in Mississippi, where the electoral advances are not yet marked, a different form of change is manifest. When Negroes decided to march for freedom across the state, they boldly advanced to the Capitol itself in a demonstration of 30,000 people. 10 years before, a Mississippi Negro would have submissively stepped to the gutter to leave the sidewalk for a white man. 10 years before, to plan a meeting, Negroes would have come together at night in the woods as conspirators. A decade ago, not a single Negro entered the legislative chambers of the South except as a porter or chauffeur. Today, 11 Negroes are members of the Georgia House. 10 years ago, Negroes almost seemed invisible to the larger society, and the fact of their harsh lives were unknown to the majority of the nation. Today, civil rights is a dominating issue in every state, crowding the pages of the press and the daily conversation of white Americans. In this decade of change, Negroes stood up and confronted his oppressor. He faced the bullies and the guns, the dogs and the tear gas. He put himself squarely before the vicious mobs and moved with strength and dignity towards them and decisively defeated them. For more than a century of slavery and another century of segregation, Negroes did not find mass unity, nor could they mount mass actions. The brand of servitude tore them apart and held them in paralyzed solitude. But in the last decade, Negroes united and marched, and out of the new unity and action, vast monuments of dignity were shaped, courage was forged, and hope took concrete form. For hundreds of years, Negroes have fought to stay alive by developing endurance to hardship and heartbreak. In this decade, the Negro stepped into a new role. He no longer would endure, he would resist and win. He still has the age-old capacity to live in hunger and want, but now he banished these as his lifelong companions. He would tolerate humiliation and scorn, but now he armed himself with dignity and resistance, and his adversary tasted the gall of defeat. For the first time in his history, the Negro did not have to use subterfuge as a defense or solicit pity. His endurance was not employed for compromise with evil, but to supply the strength to crush it. He came out of his struggle integrated only slightly in the external society, but powerfully integrated within. This was the victory that had to precede all other gains. He made the government write new laws to alter some of the cruelest injustices that affected him. He made an indifferent and unconcerned nation rise from lethargy and recognize his oppression and struggle with a newly aroused conscience. He gained manhood in a nation that had always called him boy. There were values he won that enlivened hope, and even while sluggish progress made no substantial changes in the quality or quantity of his daily bread. The great deal the Negro has won in spiritual undergirding, and the great deal he has not won in material progress, indicates the strength and weaknesses in the life of the Negro in 1967. They also reveal that no matter how many obstacles persist, the Negro's forward march can no longer be stopped. The fight is far from over, because it is neither won, as some assert, nor lost, as the calamity-ridden declare. Negroes have irrevocably undermined the foundations of Southern segregation. They have assembled the power through self-organization and coalition to place their demands on all significant national agendas. And beyond this, they have now accumulated the strength to change the quality and substance of their demands. From issues of personal dignity, they are now advancing to programs that impinge upon the basic system of social and economic control. At this level, Negro programs go beyond race and deal with economic inequality wherever it exists. In the pursuit of these goals, the white poor become involved, and the potentiality emerges for a powerful new alliance. Another momentous gain of the last decade is now being taken for granted. Negroes forged their own tactical theory of nonviolent direct action. It was born in Montgomery, Alabama, and for a time was considered of only limited application. But as it inspired and informed far-flung movements that included boycotts and sit-ins and mass marches, it became clear that a new method of protest action had been born. When legal contests were the sole form of activity, the ordinary Negro was involved as a passive spectator. His interests were stirred, but his energies were unemployed. Mass marches transformed the common man into the star performer and engaged him in a total commitment, yet nonviolent resistance caused no explosions of anger. It instigated no riots. It controlled anger and released it under discipline for maximum effect. What lobbying and employing could not do in legislative halls, marching feet accomplished 1,000 miles away. When the Southern Christian Leadership Conference went into Birmingham in 1963, it intended to change that city. But the effect of its campaign was so extensive that President Kennedy was forced to conclude that the national legislation was indispensable, and the first Civil Rights Bill with substance was enacted in 1964. Nonviolent direct action has proved to be the most effective generator of change that the movement had seen, and by 1965 all civil rights organizations had embraced it as theirs. In the past year, nonviolent direct action has been pronounced for the 10th time dead. New tactics have been proposed to replace it. The Black Power slogan was described as a doctrine that reached Negroes' hearts with so deep an appeal that no alternative method could withstand its magnetic force. Rioting was described as a new Negro form of action that evoked results when disciplined demonstrations sputtered out against implacable opposition. Yet Black Power has proved to be a slogan without a program and without an uncertain following. If it is true that controversy is not yet resolved, it is also true that no alternative to nonviolence within the movement have found viable expression. Confusion has been created, but extensive despair and dissipation of fighting strength have not occurred. By 1967, the resounding shout of the Negro's protest has shattered the myth of his contentment. The courage which he confronted enraged mobs dissolved the stereotype of a grinning, submissive Uncle Tom. Indeed, by the end of a turbulent decade, there was a new quality to a Negro life. The Negro was no longer a subject of change. He was an active organ of change. He powered the drive. He set the pace. At the same time, it became clear that through white opposition, though white opposition could be defeated, it remained a formidable force capable of hardening its resistance when the cost of change was increased. The daily life of the Negro is still lived in the basement of the Great Society. He is still at the bottom despite a few who have penetrated to slightly higher levels. Even where the door has been forced partially open, mobility for the Negro is still sharply restricted. There is often no bottom at which to start, and when there is almost always no room at the top. The Negro ghetto dweller still lives in the schizophrenic social millennia. In the past decade, he supported and derived pride from Southern struggles and accomplishments. Yet the Civil Rights Revolution appeared to drain energy from the North, energy that flowed south to transform lives there, while stagnation blanketed northern Negro communities. This was a decade of role reversal. The North, heretofore vital, languished, while the traditionally passive South burst with dynamic vigor. The North at best stood still as the South caught up. Civil rights leaders have long thought that the North would benefit derivatively from the Southern struggle. They assumed that without massive upheavals, certain systemic changes were inevitable as the whole nation re-examined and searched its conscience. This was a miscalculation. It was founded on the belief that the opposition in the North was not intransigent, it was flexible, and was, if not fully, at least partially hospitable to corrective influences. We forgot what we knew daily in the South. Freedom is not given, it is won. Concentration of effort in the northern cities can no longer be postponed in favor of southern campaigns. Both now must be sustained. In assessing the results of the Negro Revolution so far, it can be concluded that Negroes have established a foothold no more. We have written a Declaration of Independence, itself an accomplishment, but the effort to transform the words into a life experience still lies ahead. The hard truth is that neither Negro nor white has yet done enough to expect the dawn of a new day. While much has been done, it has been accomplished by too few and on a scale too limited for the breadth of the goal. Freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. Freedom is won by a struggle against suffering. By this measure, Negroes have not yet paid the full price for freedom, and whites have not yet faced the full cost of justice. The brunt of the Negroes' past battles are borne by a very small striking force. Though millions of Negroes are ardent and passionate supporters, only a modest number were actively engaged, and these were relatively too few for a broad war against racism, poverty, and discrimination. Negroes fought and won, but our engagements were skirmishes, not climatic battles. No great victories are won in a war for the transformation of a whole people without total participation. Less than this will not create a new society. It will only evoke more sophisticated token amelioration. The Negro has been wrong to toy with the optimistic thought that the breakdown of white resistance could be accomplished at a small cost. He will have to do more before his pressure crystallizes new white principles and new responses. The two forces must continue to collide as Negroes' aspirations burst against the ancient fortresses of the status quo. This should be not construed as a predicament of violence. On the one hand, there will certainly be new expressions of nonviolent direct action on a large scale. If 100,000 Negroes march in a major city to a strategic location, they will make municipal operations difficult to conduct. They will exceed the capacity of even the most reckless local government to use force against them, and they will repeat this action daily if necessary. Without harming persons or property, they can draw as much attention to their grievances as the outbreak at Watts, and they will have asserted their unwavering determination while retaining their dignity and discipline. But on the other hand, it cannot be taken for granted that Negroes would adhere to nonviolence under any and all conditions. There is rock-like extravagance or sophisticated manipulation that mocks the empty-handed petitioner. Rage replaces reason. Nonviolence is a powerful demand for reason and justice. If it is rudely rebuked, it is not transformed into resignation and passivity. Southern segregationists in many places yielded to it because they realized that the alternatives could be intolerable. Northern white leadership has relied too much on tokens and substitutes and on Negro patience. The end of this road is clearly in sight. The cohesive, potentially explosive Negro community in the North has a short fuse and a long train of abuses. Those who argue that it is hazardous to give warnings, lest the expression of apprehension leads to violence, are in error. Violence has already been practiced too often and always because the remedies were postponed. It is understandable that the white community should fear the outbreak of riots. They are indefensible as weapons of struggle, and the Negroes must sympathize with whites who feel menaced by them. Indeed, Negroes are themselves no less menaced, and those living in ghettos always suffer most directly from the destructive turbulence of a riot. Yet the average white person also has a responsibility. He has to resist the impulse to seize upon the rioter as the exclusive villain. He has to rise up with indignation against his own municipal, state, and national governments to demand that the necessary reforms be instituted, which alone will protect him. If he reserves his resentment only for the Negro, he will be the victim by allowing those who have the greatest culpability to evade responsibility. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. There is no other answer. Constructive social change will bring certain tranquility. Evasion will merely encourage turmoil. Negroes hold only one key to the double lock of peaceful change. The other is in the hands of the white community. Where are we? Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Martin Luther King Jr. What a great month of February. Reading and celebrating the great writers.